This is a Shoesmiths podcast.
Hello and welcome to our Shoesmiths podcast. This is part of a series of podcasts that we're running on the BTR sector, and the ones which I am involved in have an investor funder focus. I'm Choy-Zan Mann, a partner in the real estate team based out of the London office, specialising in investment and development with a particular focus on residential-led developments. Today's podcast focuses on topical legal issues from an investor funder perspective, and I'm delighted to be joined by John German, who is the Managing Director of Residential Investment at Invesco Real Estate. This follows on from the two earlier podcasts which John and I have done, which are available on our Shoesmiths website. Welcome, John.
Hi, Choy, how are you?
Yeah, not bad at all, thank you, and thank you very much for your time today. There are a number of legal issues that we could discuss, but I thought it would be helpful to focus our discussions on just a few areas so that we don't run over time. So the areas I wanted to focus on were, first of all, planning reforms, secondly, fire safety, and thirdly, rent controls / regulations. So let's move on to planning. As you know, the government is very keen to reform and simplify the planning system to get the economy moving and encourage the building of more residential. For example, and something we discussed on our last podcast, is the implementation of permitted development rights, such as the two-storey upward extensions and the demolition of commercial residential units to create more housing. It'd be interesting, John, just to get your views on that, and also the views as to what a fund would like to see in terms of planning reform in this sector.
Sure, and thank you for that. So, I mean, I think in terms of permitted development, I think the government is focused, I suppose, primarily on smaller areas. I mean, there may be larger scale schemes, but if you look at the sort of the two-storey extension, that's unlikely to be attractive to a fund developing institutional grade investments, and indeed, smaller scale opportunities. So they may suit local developers, and that's absolutely right and proper. It's not all about institutional investors.
Sure.
But I think looking at it from a wider perspective, I do believe that there may be some interest, and I think the key bit will be getting access to sites. I'm aware of one developer, residential developer, who's already bought a shopping centre before this announcement was made. Maybe they heard about it in the grapevine. That they bought a shopping centre to develop into residential. And so where you've got secondary or even tertiary shopping centres, which are really dying, then you can quite easily see those being attractive, especially if they're in city centres. They'll probably have a reasonable footprint. So from that perspective, they are assets which could be attractive to create build-to-rent investments in a city centre location. That I think is an area that will be potentially of interest, because I think one of the big issues facing institutional investors is actually access to stock and getting stock that allows us to deploy our capital. And we all know the planning process can take a very long time to enable projects to be delivered. And so, if there's a way of slightly fast-tracking that does allow either institutional investors or indeed any other developers to access that stock, and again, for us, it's about scale, then that has to be a good thing. I think simplification of the planning process, again, is that by just simple following that through will create greater speed to deliver these schemes. The other area which no one's really touched on, and again, it's been a hobby horse for some for a period of time, is whether there needs to be a specific asset class for build to rent, for institutional rental assets. Many years ago, I went to a conference and we talked about this. And if you just have it as a blanket use class, any rental property has to have a planning permission to be a rental property. If you or I choose to rent out our house or flat or schloss or palace or whatever we live in, then we will need to seek a planning permission. And if we want to then revert it to owner-occupier use, we may need to get a planning permission to revert back to owner-occupier use. I don't think that's what anyone wants. But of course, it does mean, how does a single buy-to-let investor deal with this? So I think it's fraught with difficulties. And what we've seen is actually Section 106 being brought in to really affect that. So creating build-to-rent investments where you have maybe a perpetuity or a Section 106 element which says this asset has a planning permission and it's got to be built to rent for a number of years. And actually, we've transacted on two investments recently where we had built to rent covenants across those for 10 years, and we're quite happy to invest in those, and they work for us. So I think it'll be interesting just to see how things change and how they evolve over time. But fundamentally, any change I think that allows more speed to market, the delivery of more sites, doesn't necessarily push up the cost of sites, because at the same time, our poor pensioners on whose behalf we're investing, we want to spend as little of their money as possible to deliver the maximum returns. So, but again, by simple maths, if there are more sites, then hopefully that means that site values certainly are not increased and maybe fall slightly. So it could be good for us all, apart from the landowners who potentially may lose out slightly.
I don't know, John, whether you saw today, there's a publication of a report from a prominent think tank about UK High Street being transformed into residential hubs in order to reverse the decline in towns and cities. I don't know whether you saw that today, but it was quite good timing, bearing in mind we're doing our podcast today.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I'm a little behind on my reading. But no. I mean, conceptually that makes great sense, and I think it's the scale of the city. I think or the hub. I think is the key thing there. If you look at what's happening, actually, people are certainly at the moment regressing into a smaller area. I live in Wandsworth in London, and we're lucky to have a high street where we have a variety of shops that pretty much anything I want I can go and buy. I don't have to go to a large supermarket because I've got a Waitrose and I've got a Marks and Spencer's within walking distance. I'm very fortunate. But if you create these hubs where I think the key bit is there's got to be enough in that central hub outside just housing to make people want to move there. There still needs to be some form of retail offer. There still needs to be some form of leisure offer. Otherwise, why would you go there unless it's really cheap, to be honest with you? So I think it's an interesting concept. The other bit is, will people want to, what one heard anecdotally about was, everyone wants to move out of London because, it's awful in London and, full of nasty people who are transmitting lots of stuff. Will people want to move back into city centres is another question. And I'll be honest, I don't know the answer to that. It could be the case, but then again, it might not. But I think the key bit, as I say, is creating an environment that people go, actually, that would work. And just to use an actual example, I'm giving away a state secret. I live close to the Northcote Road. The Northcote Road is on a bus route, and normally lots of traffic going up and down it, but it's got shops and restaurants up and down it. What the council has done is they've said every Saturday and Sunday from mid-July through to the end of August, we're going to close the road to traffic, and all the restaurants can spill out onto the road. Bars and restaurants can spill out onto the road. And the first weekend that happened, I walked out of our house and walked down to the road, and all I could hear was the sound of people talking, and it just created a whole new vibe. And it was like, wow, this is great. Wouldn't this be cool if it were to happen? It may only happen, when it's sunny, or you could make it more of perhaps some more permanent structures. So I think it's about, if those sort of things happen, then you've actually got to create the environment for people to want to go there. And if you're a family, you need schooling. If you're a teenager, you probably want a bar. If you're me, I don't know what I want. Fundamentally, creating the place, and it's about placemaking, and just in a different context. And I think we all go back to what all the sort of great estates did back in the day, and people are trying to do with new developments. It's about good placemaking. Just dumping a load of houses in the middle of a town with nothing else around it probably won't work anymore.
So we might all be moving to Northcote Road then, John.
Please do, because it'll push up the values, and therefore I'll be very happy.
Thanks for that, John. So let's move on to fire safety. And we're talking about fire safety, especially post-Grenfell. And what an investor is looking at in order to be satisfied on this aspect and satisfied that the building they are investing in is safe.
Yeah, so after Grenfell, as a business, Invesco audited 100% of our real estate assets across Europe, not just residential, every asset that we had in our portfolio. So I think Grenfell brought into sharp focus. Fire safety is something that is very much needs to be high on everyone's agenda. Sure. I think in terms of checks and balances, when we look at any investment, be it a standing investment or be it a development project, and indeed across asset classes, but we're talking about residential, so let's just stick to that. We will look at the design of that building. We will look at what the component parts are. The external cladding that burns the slowest is brick. So if you've got brick, you're starting off in a good place, but it's what insulation sits behind the brick. It's then what fire stopping you've got associated with that insulation. It's then, is the building sprinklered or not? Again, because legislation is such that over certain heights, you have to have sprinkled systems. Also with build to rent, obviously the concept of more open plan living, even if the building wasn't over that required height, had to have sprinkled systems. So you start to build in a series of checks and balances that you can create that will seek to mitigate the risk of fire and a Grenfell situation arising. You can't legislate for everything, but what you can do is to maximize the mitigation that you can create in any one building. So, we have a checklist that we look at every time, and, part of the role of our technical advisor will be to look at fire and fire safety. And as I say, because I'm just thinking I'm going to say all of our buildings, I just need to, before I make that absolute statement, I can't think of any of our buildings that do not have sprinkler systems throughout, strong fire. We also undertake fire because historically the fire brigade undertook annual fire inspections. Obviously that's now something that we commission as part of our overarching health and safety work on buildings. So again, we are able to do that. And fortunately, we've had no buildings. We've had one building where there was a small amount of cladding on that building. And so as part of that, we removed the cladding. We've had, until fresh cladding has been fitted, we've had 24-hour security and fire watch going on in that building. So, we do ensure where we do identify a problem that we deal with it properly and deal with it as quickly as possible. But we've been very fortunate that was a very minor part of one building, and say that's now been rectified. Good.
So that brings us on to the final area I'd like to discuss with you, and that is rent controls.
Yeah, and I think this is something which I think it was Ed Miliband in most recent times brought it up as one of his Edstone moments. And rent control and affordability is something that is nothing new. And indeed, if you look wider across Europe, it's very prevalent across, a large number of European residential markets. One of the potential attractions historically from the UK market is the assured short-hold tenancy is a negotiated rent between landlord and tenant. I think there's rent controls that investors can effectively vicariously introduce. We like to offer 3-year tenancy agreements. And in doing that, we like to say to our tenants, well, let's fix the rent review so that you know what you're going to be paying this year, next year, and the year after if you stay that long. So that's an implicit rent control without us actually having rent controls already in place. For us as an investor, actually having someone stay longer in a property, having someone being able to pay the rent and not having any voids, two of the things that we factor into our analysis of voids and bad debt. If I have no void and I have no bad debt, I actually therefore potentially getting more rent, even if the rent's a bit lower. So, for us, the introduction of rent controls is something that we don't fear. And indeed, we are fully cognizant of the fact that we need to look at opportunities where the rents are affordable. And, I was just looking at some statistics across our fund in terms of rents and salaries. And actually on our regional portfolio, we have 10% of our tenant base actually have salaries of £15,000 a year or less. So, we are actually providing, I wouldn't say, they are rents that are affordable to people at that level. So, and again, in the regions, about 50% of our portfolio, the rents are paid by people working in the public sector. So, I think we've got implicit rent controls within what we're doing. But if the government were to bring in rent controls, actually, if a tenant knows what they're going to pay and what the increases are going to be, then that's great. I think the key bit is making it something that people can comprehend. Will everybody know what rents can be increased in line with RPI or CPI or CPIH? Does that mean something to some people? Maybe you just say, each year, does the government come out each year in the same way as they do with rail fares and say rail fares this year go up by X? So they say this year rents will go up by Y. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how it develops. But as I say, it's something that ultimately we are happy to engage with government if they want to in respect of our views on this. And certainly, will it kill the sector? Will it be something that makes investors walk away? I would say absolutely not. So from that perspective, it's a situation where if it's introduced, we will engage, we will see how it feeds through. And but I'd say at the moment, certainly current government has not really come out saying they're looking to introduce rent controls.
Sure. Thank you for that, John.
Pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of our final podcast. I just want to say, John, thank you. You've been absolutely delightful. I know that you're a very busy man, so really appreciate you spending some time with us.
Joy, absolute pleasure. And of course, if at any time you'd like a podcast for, I'd be very happy to facilitate.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you very much. So to the listeners out there, if you'd like to discuss any aspect of this podcast further, then please don't hesitate to get in contact with me. My details are on the Shoosmiths website. Thank you.